to take about 15 or so minutes for questions. If you could just raise your hand. Once you get called on, stand up, say your question loudly. I will repeat the question since we are trying to record this. Hopefully it's going to work. If your question is directed to a specific panelist, let them know. If it's a general question, that's cool too. So feel free to chime in. Does anybody have any questions to start us off? Yes.
Hi, my name is Angela. I have a question for Robin. If you have a community church, a community garden attached to a church, you mentioned the profit. Can the community garden make enough money just to support itself and still not jeopardize the church or create any extra tax issues?
Can I just repeat the question?
Yeah.
So the question was, if a community garden is attached to a church, can the community garden make enough money to support itself without jeopardizing any sort of status for the church?
Yeah, first I'm glad you asked that question because it reminded me, there's also a side lot program in Baltimore City, which I do not know the details of, but if
there's a vacant lot that's directly next to your property, like your home, I think you would probably still include churches.
Yeah, it would.
Yeah, if there's a vacant lot next to your property, you can actually now purchase that vacant lot for $500. This is awesome because they can sometimes be as much as $30,000. So if there's a vacant lot next to your house, flat rate $500 to purchase it.
Is that just city-owned lots?
City-owned lots, yeah. If it's a private owner, it's really to the discretion of the owner.
Yeah, so getting back to the question though, so if the garden is making money and just supporting itself, a lot of it just goes to the intent behind the project. So are you intending to make a profit on the garden? If the answer is no, I think you're already okay. Are you intending to, help feed the community? Is that what you're trying to do? Then I think you're fine. I would also just mention churches are kind of a whole other ball of wax for nonprofits. Because of separation of church and state, there's a lot more leeway for churches than there are for other nonprofits. There's a lot less in terms of registration requirements and reporting requirements for churches.
And by the way, the church does own the land.
So the church
they
owns the
own
land,
the land.
so that's great.
It's part of their property.
Yeah. The other thing I just thought of randomly about ownership, the reason ownership is complicated, and part of the reason there are so many vacant lots in the city, this is something that perplexed me since I moved here. I'm like, why are there so many vacant lots and vacant buildings? Why can't we just get those back into productive use? And part of it is really liens. So there's tax liens, there's people that just haven't paid anything. A lot of times there used to be a house on that property and the city went in, it was unsafe, so the city went in and demolished the house. Then the city bills the owner for all of that work, and it's not cheap to have the city demolish your house. So, and then there's all the legal fees associated with that. So what ends up happening is you might be in a neighborhood that doesn't have, where the market is completely collapsed, but that lot is $30,000 in the hole already, or $100,000 in the hole. So that's part of the reason that the property issues in Baltimore City are so complicated, and part of the reason it's so hard to get out from under. This goes for buildings as well. So.
Yeah.
Distinguish between profit and salary in a sense?
The question was, can you distinguish between profit and salary?
Profit
So
and
like if you're
salary.
making a profit on your project versus people are being paid a salary, what is sort of the salary guideline at which point it exceeds into profit?
Well, a nonprofit can pay people a salary. I mean, I make a salary, luckily,
Right.
and I work for a nonprofit. So there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there are some rules that I really wouldn't worry about this community getting into trouble with that because I feel like fundraising is really tough in greening projects. So, there's nothing wrong with making a salary at a nonprofit. There is a problem sometimes with excessive compensation. Like I said, you guys probably don't have to worry about that.
I don't think so.
So yeah, if you're like way over the amount that's reasonable for what would normally be paid to a nonprofit worker, that could be an issue. For nonprofits, this mainly comes up in conflict of interest situations. So if the board of directors for a nonprofit starts paying itself a lot of money, or paying a family member a lot of money, something like that, that starts to look a little shady, and I would be careful. But other than that, salary is not a problem. Salary is not a problem. That's not considered profit. That's considered you're doing work.
The organization.
Yeah.
And it just needs to balance out, right? Like I spent $500 setting up this community garden and running it for the season, and we made $500 in like stand sales on the corner. We did not make a profit. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, then you're also starting to get into like employment law issues. I'm not even gonna go there because it's really complicated. I mean, independent contractor stuff is really complicated, and right now the state and federal government are really hurting for money, and it's an area where they are heavily enforcing. So if you're employing somebody in any way, get a lawyer, because it can sink the whole project and sink the whole organization. And I hate to be that way about it, but it really, I've seen it, so just be careful if you're employing anyone at all.
There was a question in the back.
I appreciate the discussion on vacant lots, but I actually own my lot, and where my house is, I have about a quarter acre. And I may have missed this, but can you guys speak just a little bit about, do I need to get that zoned differently before I start? Right now, I'm kind of doing this garden for myself, and it's morphing into something else. So what concerns should I have about that before I dig up my garden?
So the question was, we've talked a lot about vacant lots, but if you own your own lot that you are growing on, in this case, a personal garden that's morphing into a little bit more, what sort of zoning or permits or considerations does one need to take? Great question, thank you.
Resources where I can go.
Yeah.
So right now, there is no zoning or permitting related to gardening or farming. Under the new zoning code, community gardening will be permitted everywhere except certain industrial areas. So you shouldn't have to worry about getting your lot rezoned.
But for an urban farm.
Yeah, or for farms. It'll be a conditional use in all those zones except for those few industrial zones. So I'm assuming that you're not living in an industrial site, so there's nothing you need to do to try to change your zoning to make it easier for you to do either a community garden or an urban farm. It will be equally easy everywhere.
But there would still be a permit.
Yeah, you would need to
That would
get
be
it,
the
yeah.
same,
There would be a permit process as I laid out in this thing. And that's if you're doing a community garden or an urban farm. If you're just growing food in your backyard for your own consumption, as long as you're not breaking any other laws, you should be fine. If you are, so if you're doing that, if you're just growing for yourself, there aren't a ton of resources for you. There's a lot of information, but not a lot of resources. If you're trying to start a community garden, whether it's on your own property or on somebody else's property or whatever, then there are a lot of resources for you. Small grants through the Parks and People Foundation, support through the Community Greening Resource Network, etc. Does that answer?
You can join the Community Greening Resource Network as an individual.
But you don't get access to all the same resources.
Actually, you do now.
You do now?
Yeah, so
So they just, Sea Green, which is short for Community Greening Resource Network, just changed their policy. So individuals, community gardens, schools, groups, it's all the same. You all get the same amount of stuff.
And let me also just respond to that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next section in terms of sort of individual for-profit, which is something that we're seeing more and more in Baltimore City. So the Farm Alliance, which is really newly formed, is one resource that's out there. The Beginning Farmer Training Program, which Kathy mentioned at the beginning, which is run by Future Harvest, is another great resource. There's weekly workshops. These are sort of the specific urban component of that, but there are weekly workshops that cover a lot of topics, and that's a 8-part or 10-part series? 8-part series for $40 at the Ag Extension. And then there's also some other sort of workshop opportunities popping up. So we'll be sure to talk more about that in the next piece, but I think it's a really great question.
I would also suggest, and this really goes for everybody, that greening and gardening and farming in Baltimore City is not a new thing. It's been going on for a long time, and there's lots of really wonderful groups out there that have been doing this for a while, and they're all 100% receptive to talking to new people. So if you're starting a community garden or you're starting an urban farm on whatever kind of land, there's probably somebody out there that's done it once and would be happy to share information with you. And those are easy to find, but especially if you talk to us, 'cause we know what most of them are.
Does that answer your question?
Almost all of it, but I'll ask the rest of it later.
Cool, thanks.
I have
Yeah.
a quick question. Is there any distinction between food production and flowers or herbs that aren't going to be for consumption but could be for sale?
So that,
So the question, no, that's cool. So the question was, is there any distinction between food production and production of cut flowers or herbs that might not be used for consumption?
As
Great
far as, like,
question.
specifically to like the adopt-a-lot, if there's going to be, aside, I'm assuming, I guess, with the soil, but as far as zoning or anything different.
yeah, the sole distinction in the permitting process is that you don't need to worry about testing the soil and presenting anything about safety if you're not growing food for consumption. As far as I know, there aren't any other differences.
You might still want to test the soil for your own personal
Yeah,
health.
Probably do.
so I didn't mention what was allowed on an adopt-a-lot. Abby mentioned you're not allowed to build a permanent structure. This is really, it pretty much is flexible. It basically just means don't pour concrete for the most part. Don't build a house. You can build a hoop house, a greenhouse, raised beds, a shed, but to answer your question more specifically, other than that, other than building a house, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So what we do suggest, however, is depending on what you're going to do, you're going to take a different approach. All of the vacant, or the majority of the vacant lots in Baltimore City used to have a house on it. And even besides that, the soil is not necessarily, grade A growing soil. So if you want to, grow edibles, you definitely want to get your soil tested. I brought some flyers for that over here. But if you aren't, if you're doing flowers or herbs, herbs you might want to do topsoil. Flowers, it's up to you whether you want them to be soaking up arsenic or not,
Yeah, we would want so.
Yeah.
And then, second question, what about fencing?
Fencing is allowed.